We're back with President LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who will take over, be our 36th president after the assassination of JFK. So we have two acronym presidents back-to-back, JFK and LBJ. As you can see there, he will serve for 6 years, so he'll finish out with the last year and a half of, of Kennedy's term, and then he will win re-election in 64. But then he chooses not to run for election in 68, so his term ends in January of 69. One of the more important one-term presidents that we have, but there are a lot of, actually there's three super important one-termers, Kennedy, Johnson, and then most importantly, Lincoln. But that's a separate story or a separate argument for another day. So, background on Johnson. He was born in Texas to a not very rich family. Okay, family ran into a bunch of financial problems during his teens. They will be on the verge of eviction or losing everything multiple times. He'll struggle in school, right? He won't be super focused with all that stuff going on at home. It makes sense, I suppose. But he will manage to graduate, and he goes to college. In college, he will join the debate and political clubs, and he finds what he believes he is meant to do for the rest of his life, and that's politics. He'll graduate, and he'll teach for a year, but then he enters into politics in the state of Texas. He'll become a congressional aide, so an assistant to a congressman. Then he eventually takes that congressman's job when that congressman retires. Then he becomes a senator, then vice president, and then president. So he ends up going through pretty much all the stages of the legislative branch and the executive branch before becoming president. He'll meet his wife, Claudia, also known as Lady Bird, while they were both aides for the same congressman. And he will become president, of course, after JFK gets assassinated in Dallas. So, there's LBJ, and there's Lady Bird. He'll have one daughter, I think just one, and he'll be very intense, right? Where Kennedy was more of a talker, Johnson's much more of a yeller, and he will yell at people all the time. So, before becoming president, LBJ served as four of these are correct. Is it a congressman, a governor, a senator, a vice president, a secretary of state, or a congressional aide? 4 of those are correct. All right, so JFK dies, LBJ becomes president. And for that year, not a whole ton of stuff gets done. But Johnson will start beating the drum of, we need to pass some things that Kennedy wanted as sort of an homage to him, to honor his legacy. And one of those things he will get passed will be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Civil Rights Act that JFK helped write and helped push, that'll end segregation, or at least outlaw segregation in all public places and all public things and all sorts of other very important stuff, one of the most important civil rights laws we ever passed. He also passed some tax cuts that Kennedy wanted to pass. These will be the last set of tax cuts that actually end up paying for themselves. And then he'll run in 64 on his own platform of social reform, what he calls the Great Society. He says we can give all Americans a place in a new great society. And that's what he's going to try to do. So he will run with Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. The only reason you need to know who Humphrey is that he eventually runs for president and loses. He runs against Barry Goldwater and somebody named Miller who you don't need to know. Barry Goldwater was an extreme conservative. At this point in American history in 64, his ideas were considered dangerously extreme on the conservative end. But within 16 years, by 1980, Ronald Reagan had adopted every single one of Goldwater's positions, and that was eventually becomes the foundation of the modern conservative party. So at one point it was seemed to be too far to the right, too extreme, but now that is basically the platform of the Republican Party. That starts with Goldwater, then through Reagan up until the current day. So, Johnson, though, is going to win in a landslide. America was not ready for someone as extremely conservative as Barry Goldwater, and Johnson's going to crush him, 486 to 52. Not particularly close. Also, important to note there at the bottom, the Democrats win control of the Congress and the Senate, which means that the American people really believed in the idea of a great society, I suppose, and they gave LBJ everything he needed to pass the majority of that program, right? The Democrats controlled the Congress, the Senate, and the White House, which makes it easy for them to pass laws. So, on the left, some campaign buttons, Johnson and Humphrey, Goldwater and Miller. You can see Goldwater and Miller won Arizona, where Goldwater was from, and then 5 states in the South, and then the rest go to Johnson. You can see Texas here voting Democratic. Might be the last time Texas has done that. I know for sure. I grew up in Utah. This is the last time that Utah voted Democratic. So things will start changing here during this presidency. So, true or false? At the time, Barry Goldwater's platform seemed too conservative, extreme even. But within 16 years, the Republican Party adopted almost an identical set of ideas. Is this true or is this false? All right, so on to President Johnson's domestic policies, what he called the Great Society. So that was his package aimed at ending poverty, promoting equality, protecting the environment, and reforming healthcare and immigration. The biggest part of this will be the war on poverty. So there were 3 parts to the war on poverty. Number 1, he's going to cut some taxes to spur economic growth. He was going to help the poor recover and train for jobs. He was going to create Medicare and Medicaid while expanding Social Security and welfare programs. So, to do all that stuff, he creates the Office of Economic Opportunity, which opened up regional economic development offices all throughout the country to help people train for jobs and all that sort of stuff. He created the Head Start education program, which was for poor kids to go to sort of preschool, kindergarten type programs to get them a start into education so that they would be successful and want to continue through their educational experience. He funded elementary and secondary schools with an extra $1 billion. And he also started a program called Upward Bound, which helped kids get into college. So he really saw education as a measure to cut poverty. So, obviously, Medicare and Medicaid, super important, still around. So President Lyndon Baines Johnson's legislative program that include massive funding for ending poverty was called what? A, the New Deal, B, the Fair Deal, C, the New Frontier, or D, the Great Society. So, there's a big question. Did the war on poverty work? And to a large extent, I would say yes, but to another extent, I would say no. So when he took office, poverty was around 22%, and by the time he leaves office, poverty is below 13%. So it goes down, almost 10%. So that's awesome, right? And it'll stay below, 17% for the rest of American history. So there was the legit positive cutting of poverty. However, it did not provide enough what we call a ladder up for people who start very poor to end up dying in the middle class or in the upper class. There wasn't a real sustained ladder for people in our country, and that still continues to this day, where you're overwhelmingly likely to die in the same socioeconomic place that you were born into. So that would be a failure in terms of the war on poverty. So, what did the war on poverty include? There are 3 of these that are correct. Was it A, regional economic development centers? B, universal basic income? C, Head Start programs and school funding? D, tax cuts? Or E, a universal jobs guarantee? All right, continue with the Great Society. The Medicare Act of 1965 creates Medicare for elderly Americans. So you hit 65 and you can start applying for Medicare. Right? Medicare provides low-cost medical treatment for old people. They did this because old people were dying because they couldn't afford healthcare, right? So I want to make sure that went away. Medicaid, which might be on a future slide, but I talk about right now, is basically low-cost healthcare for very poor people who were dying because they couldn't afford healthcare. Other important thing to note about Medicare is that is how we determine how much anything costs in terms of medical treatment, right? So say a knee operation costs, Medicare says we'll pay $100, right? We'll let you charge $100 for, or we will charge $100 for a knee replacement, right? The way the law works is that any private company can only charge X amount more than what Medicare charges. So if Medicare charges $100 and they determine that you can only charge 7 times as much as Medicare, then you can only charge $700, right? Obviously, those aren't the correct numbers for knee replacements, but that's how Medicare is basically the only thing that we have in our country that helps keep healthcare costs a little bit down, which isn't really working because healthcare costs are out of control. All right, anyways, Immigration Act of 1965 was passed under LBJ. This will now base immigration on first come, first serve, and with a preference given to families and skilled workers. That's basically how it still goes. Remember, up until this point, it was a quota system. And the quota was based on the 1890 census. So if 100 people came to America from Venezuela in 1890, then up until 1965, only 3% of that number could come every year, which means 3 Venezuelans every year, right? That's another just extreme example, but or at least a made-up extreme example to make the numbers easier. But this is how we change it. Now, if you apply first, then you will get your stuff processed first. Unless someone applies after you that is a skilled worker. We love bringing over all the skilled workers from the rest of the world. We don't necessarily love if they want to bring like a cousin or someone that isn't a skilled worker, but we do have family reunification policies and stuff like that too, and this all starts in 65. He'll also help create the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is now called HUD, which is now a cabinet-level position. This was created in 1966 to provide money for 240,000 housing units and urban renewal. As we did an activity in regular U.S., we didn't have time to do an AP on public housing in Newark, New Jersey. This is always controversial. They called it slum clearance, and they'd often destroy black and brown neighborhoods and then make them much nicer, and then they'd be priced out, and then white people would move in, what we call gentrification. So it's still kind of controversial. Some HUD directors were awesome. Mitt Romney, who's a senator from Utah, who mostly sucks, his father was a great HUD director and did a lot of really awesome things, helping poor people and working class people get housing. There are some HUD directors that have been very, very bad. So again, just like everything else in government, depending on who's in charge, it can be good or bad. They'll also pass a whole bunch of consumer protection laws to protect us when companies do bad things and, take our money. So, next question, true or false? The Immigration Act of 1965 moved away from quotas and moved towards a system that was based on a first-come, first-served basis with preferences given to families and skilled workers. Is that true or is that false? All right, here he is signing into law Medicare and HUD. Obviously, around him while he's signing in the Medicare legislature are a bunch of old people because it was designed to help them, and then HUD, you can see there on the right. Also, you can see on the right a bazillion pens. If you ever watch any of the times that President Trump signed something or any of the film of former presidents signing something, they'll sign each letter of their name with a different pen, and that pen then becomes some super cool souvenir, and they hand it out to the people that are around them while they're signing legislation. All right, continue with the Great Society. They will establish the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. LBJ will agree with former President Franklin Roosevelt that arts and the humanities are very important to American culture. So they established a government program to make sure that there's still money flowing to artists and humanities people to make sure they can continue producing that part of our culture. Also created the Public Broadcasting System, PBS, which is still around. Passed the Water Quality Act and Air Quality Act to help make the environment more sustainable, right? Government could set clean water standards for states and force industries to clean up after themselves. Up until this point, it didn't matter. Companies were just destroying the environment with absolutely zero repercussions. The government could also set standards for gas or chemical air emissions. This is very much a precursor to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And he'll continue investing lots and lots of money into the space program. So here he is signing into law the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. PBS there, of course, home to Sesame Street, also home to a great show called American Experience I'd recommend. I have a lot of really awesome episodes, sort of like hour-long documentaries into things. Get a lot of info from them because they're very well made. All right, civil rights. President Johnson will be one of our most influential presidents in terms of civil rights. Obviously not as important as Lincoln, who helped prosecute the Civil War and outlaw slavery and all that sort of stuff, but very much a 1A to Lincoln's 1. So, he will recognize that segregation and racism divided Americans and maintained white political power. He said, and I quote, "If you can convince the lowest white man that he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him someone to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you." So he is saying that, obviously, segregation and racism is doing bad things, but it's also allowing not very good people in power to take advantage of poor white people by turning them against poor colored people, right? He's saying if you give poor white people someone to look down on, that they will empty their pockets for you, right? And that's what he's saying the political establishment had done up until that point, right? So He'll help pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after JFK's death and create the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He'll also pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we talked about in the Civil Rights Lecture, but for review, this will help ensure the voting rights for African Americans just barely under 100 years after the 15th Amendment was passed that guaranteed the right to vote to black men. They actually get that right because of the Voting Rights Act. So it outlaws things like literacy tests and poll taxes, and it puts the federal government in as election observers in states that had lots of racial violence or lots of racial discrimination. So, literally, within 1 year, 740,000 black Americans had registered to vote that hadn't voted before because they're afraid to get lynched for voting. This will shake up politics a lot. Okay, a lot of people say this is when the party switch happens, but we talked about this with civil rights. It isn't, but it's kind of the nail in the coffin. A lot of Southern Democrats were upset with the Northern Democratic leadership, especially on civil rights. So many of them will leave the party after this. But before that, many had started leaving the party and going to the Republican Party for other things like economics or governmental policy disagreements and stuff like that. And at the same time, lots of Republicans leave the Republican Party and join the Democratic Party, especially Republicans of color leaving the Republican Party because now they see that the Democrats are the party of civil rights. So they'll leave on that accord. So we get the more modern configuration, the Republican Southern stronghold, right? The South basically always votes Republican. The coast will basically always vote Democratic. The North will be more Democratic than the South. The Midwest is a free-for-all. The West is kind of a free-for-all. So here he is signing into law, the Voting Rights Act. And you can see how big of a difference it makes. Well, let's look at Alabama there because it's the top line. In 1965, right, 69% of all whites voted, right, were registered to vote and voted. At the same time, only 19% of black people had voted. So that's a 50% margin, 50% gap right there. And we're not saying it's the same number of people, we're saying it's the same percent. We're looking at the percentages here. So within 40 years in Alabama, 73.8% of all white people registered to vote. 72.9% of all black people were registered to vote. So they equalize it. So it does, like I said, the numbers aren't ever the same. There's more white people than black people, but the same percentage of each are a lot closer, are registered to vote and able to actually vote, which is a huge deal. You'll notice Virginia is the one still with the biggest spread there, and the big reason there is that Virginia doesn't ever let you vote if you get convicted of a felony. After the war on drugs, many black people will get convicted of felonies and never get their right to vote again. However, this year I believe the Virginia legislature passed a law to re-enfranchise felons in most cases, so that number will change a bit as well. So, how many black Americans registered to vote the year after the Voting Rights Act was passed? Was it A, 120,000, B, 530,000, C, 740,000, or D, 1.1 million? All right, continuing on with civil rights. Affirmative action, very controversial. So affirmative action is a program that forces universities or corporations to admit or hire racial minorities. So the big idea here was that like we looked at in the Civil Rights Lecture, for at least 265 years there was slavery. And then for the next 100 years there was segregation. So literally for about 350 years we held black people back, right, through slavery or segregation and lynching, or other racial minorities like brown people in the Southwest, like Latino immigrants or Chicano migrants and stuff like that. We also held Asian immigrants back with things like segregated schooling for them or laws like that, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, and all that stuff. So we held a bunch of people back. So affirmative action was a goal to try to correct that a little bit, get more of them into college, get more of them into corporations, get more of them with good, stable incomes to help kind of fix some of the racial disparities in our country. If you remember from the Latino Civil Rights Lecture, right, in the year 1961, 91% of all people in college in the country were white. And that was not the percentages of how the country was broken down at that point, right? Not 91% of the country was white, but 91% of all the people in college were white. So they wanted to fix that, right? So it was super controversial. It's super controversial now, although it's not really around super a lot right now. It faced lots of legal challenges. Some states have banned it or tried to ban it. What it will result in is a 60% increase in students of color in universities. It also leads to more people of color in high levels of corporate positions and stuff like that. The one group here that I will like to single out that got the biggest benefit from affirmative action policies were white women. Right? Women weren't really allowed into colleges a lot. There's a whole lot of gross things going on with admissions there as well, and that drastically changes with affirmative action policies. Is it still around? Kind of. Colleges are legally allowed to promote diversity and to want to have a more diverse student population because it has been proven to be academically positive to have a more diverse environment. So they can look at racial or ethnic background as a positive, right? What you cannot do is have a certain quota number. So you can't say, hey, we've got 2,000 open spots, so 1,000 of them are going to go to white people and the other 1,000 are going to go to people of color. You can't have a number set, right? Was there ever affirmative action programs for, say, like white men? You could say yes. There's a thing called legacy admissions where, like, if my father had gone to Yale, there's a much better chance that I get into Yale even if I don't meet all of their requirements. That's still around. There's still lots of legacy admissions, especially at high-powered institutions like a Harvard or a Yale or a Princeton. So whatever, right? Still very controversial, still kind of around. You know, a lot of people railing on and on and on about it. There just was a Supreme Court case 3 years ago. A girl by the name of Becky wanted to get into the University of Texas at Austin and was denied, and she said that they were keeping minority students above her that had worse grades. It went to the Supreme Court, and Becky lost, so it's still kind of around. The state of Texas does a huge affirmative action sort of program. If you're in the top 10% of your high school, then you automatically get admission into the University of Texas at Austin, UT, right, where the Longhorns play. And that is still constitutionally okay, so, you know, all over. So, other stuff. He will appoint Thurgood Marshall, famous NAACP lawyer, to be the first black Supreme Court justice. And he taps Robert Weaver to be the first black cabinet member. War on poverty legislation is going to help minority populations, which will also be part of his civil rights legacy. So on the left, Thurgood Marshall, who will serve up until late 80s, early 90s, before he retires. And on the right, Robert Weaver. So, affirmative action policies increase minority college enrollment by what percentage? 20, 40, 60, or 80%? A, B, C, or D? All right, Vietnam. So, we're going to have a whole day on Vietnam as well, but got to talk about LBJ and we talk about Vietnam. So, ultimately, Vietnam will be just as big of a legacy or a big part of LBJ's legacy as civil rights or as the war on poverty or the Great Society, right? This will ultimately lead to his downfall as president. He will bungle Vietnam in a very gross, sort of red, scary, Cold War, anti-communist way. It's going to lead to lots and lots and lots of people dying and lots, less important, but lots and lots of money being wasted that could have been used on actually helping people. This all starts with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So we had a boat off of the Gulf of Tonkin, which is part of Vietnam. It's off of their eastern shoreline. While our boat was there doing reconnaissance and all sorts of other stuff, it got a little closer than it technically was supposed to, and it supposedly came under fire, right, by some North Vietnamese gunboats. They were shooting torpedoes at us. We had sonar. It wasn't very good. They maybe shot some stuff, so we blew them right out of the water. Turns out much later, actually not much later, turns out almost immediately we realized that they hadn't actually shot at us and that they were just fishing ships and we just killed some innocent people. However, who cares? We use this incident to justify sending troops in, right? He'll go to Congress, LBJ, and he'll say, listen, they're shooting at us. It's an act of war. We need to send troops in there. We need to protect ourselves and blah, 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 blah. Even though he knew that that wasn't true, right? He said, for all I know, we could be shooting at whales out there. But he will use the Gulf of Tonkin incident to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, which gave him unlimited war-making authority in Vietnam. So during his presidency, he'll send 538,000 troops. 538,000 to Vietnam. Okay? But, like I said, I'll focus on more of that later with our Vietnam lecture. So, on the right, you can see the headline, U.S. destroyer beats off an attack by 3 red Vietnam torpedo boats that turned out to be fishing boats. There's LBJ in his office at his desk, going over war plans or anything else, I guess. Fun aside here, real quick, a funny story about LBJ. On his desk, he had 3 buttons installed, right? Blue, red, and green. So he loved calling people into his office and then looking at some sheets, picking up his phone and yelling and freaking out, throwing the sheets on the ground and then saying, well, hell, let's do it, and hitting the red button. And then the people that were watching him would freak out thinking he just launched a nuclear attack or something. The red button was a call down to the kitchen to bring up some iced tea. So he'd hit the red button and the person would freak out thinking World War III just started, and then one of the maids or whatever would bring up some iced tea, and then they'd have some iced tea and he'd laugh, which is kind of funny. I'd do the same thing if I were president. All right, anyways, why did America get involved in Vietnam? Was it A, because they had unlimited natural resources, the Vietnamese did, and we wanted to take them? B, to stop the spread of communism? C, because North and South Vietnam wanted to reunite their countries? Or D, because it was a third world country and the United States thought it would be an easy conquest? Remember what era we're in? It's still the Cold War. I'll help you answer that question. All right, so talking about Vietnam, we'll talk more about Ali too with Vietnam, but I love Muhammad Ali. You notice when you're in my classroom that I got an awesome picture, an awesome print of him hanging up. So Muhammad Ali was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world, and he was by far the most popular athlete in the country at this time. He was born Cassius Clay, but he converts to Islam in 1961, joins the Nation of Islam, and changes his name. March of 1966, he gets drafted to serve in Vietnam, which was not like an actual drafting. They weren't going to give him a gun and say, go and shoot people. They wanted him to go and entertain troops, right? Kind of like how Elvis did and other people. But he would not, because he was against the war. He was against war in general, and he was especially against the war in Vietnam. So he declares himself a conscientious objector to the war and says that he will not fight. His decision will turn him from being one of the most popular athletes in the country to the most hated athlete in the country, one of the most hated men in the country. But he didn't care. He held strong to his convictions. Let me give you a quote. He said, my conscience won't let me go shoot my brother or some darker people or some poor hungry people in the mud for big powerful America. And shoot them for what? They never called me the N-word. They never lynched me. They didn't put no dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape and kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what? How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail. Right? Because for refusing induction, you could be put in jail, right? So literally, when they induct you into the army, if it's a draft, which we don't really have anymore because of Vietnam, they bring you into the room, and you're supposed to step forward to accept your drafting. He refused to step forward. So he gets arrested, charged with draft dodging, which is a felony. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison, had his boxing license and his championship stripped from him, and he was unable to box for 3 years while he spent basically every penny he had fighting his conviction. Eventually, in 1974, 8 years later, they will overturn his conviction. A lot of people recognize Ali as one of the greatest fighters of all time. Tactically, boxing-wise, he might not have been the greatest boxer of all time, but he was by far the most important boxer of all time because of the social stance he was willing to take. Right? He was really one of the first athletes to not care about his celebrity or his endorsements and to continue doing what he thought was morally correct. In 1967, so a year after he gets stripped of his title, he holds what they call the Ali Summit in Cleveland. It was a meeting of prominent African-American athletes who were in support of Muhammad Ali. It included people like Jim Brown, highly regarded as maybe the best running back in the history of football. Bill Russell, one of the greatest basketball players in all of history. Won 11 titles, right? He's won the most championships of any athlete ever. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the all-time leading scorer in NBA history. This was an example, one of the first huge examples of athletes uniting together to fight for social justice, and this social justice was against the war in Vietnam. So there he is right there, speaking, right? Obviously we all know he was also one of the greatest trash talkers of all time. Up on the top right there after they arrested him to charge him with draft dodging. There at the bottom, Clay gets 5 years, $10,000 fine. They didn't like to call him by Muhammad Ali. A lot of people didn't respect his decision to convert to Islam, his decision to change his name, so they call him Clay. If you ever watch the movie Ali starring Will Smith, he gets into a boxing match with a guy that refuses to call him Ali, so he keeps punching him in the face and saying, what's my name, until he eventually knocks the guy out. So here's the Ali Summit. You can see there's Bill Russell, who was a center for the Celtics and eventually a player-coach for the Celtics on the left. On the right of Ali, on that picture on the left, is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who himself was named Lou Alcindor when he was born, also converts to Islam, also changes his name. He did that right after he graduates college. And then that picture on the right, you see more black athletes, more social activists around him, including Jim Brown, who's sitting there at the table next to him. So the counterculture will be a response that comes up in the Vietnam age, and we'll talk a little bit more about it too, but especially during the LBJ part and the Nixon part of Vietnam. So in response to the escalation of Vietnam and the coming of age of the baby boomers, a new movement started. So basically when all the boomers got to college, a lot of them became very much anti-war and very much anti-establishment. They'll start forming groups on college campuses to protest the war, to demand free speech, and to rebel against the expectations of society. Older Americans saw this movement as one based on flamboyant dress, rock music, drug use, and communal living. Basically, they call them all hippies. Right? You damn hippies don't understand anything. Quit protesting against the war. So a big example of it will be Woodstock. Right? So here they are, resisting the draft, people burning their draft cards, make love, not war. Here's Woodstock, of course, the most famous music festival of this sort of era. So, which group represented the counterculture that was anti-war? Right? Their lifestyle was often characterized by flamboyant dress, rock music, drug use, and communal living. What do we call those people? Groupies, hippies, beatniks, or rockers. All right, so end of the LBJ lectures. Was the Great Society a success or a failure? Like I said, the war on poverty will ultimately fail. It will cut poverty by half, but was constantly underfunded and failed to build a ladder to keep people out of the lower classes, right? You might be able to get out for a while, but maybe not forever. They didn't build and sustain a ladder moving forward. This will never see this go all the way to fruition because Nixon and Reagan will kill it. Flood of legislation that has had widespread and long-felt consequences. Here's some successes: Medicare, Medicaid, the Department of Transportation and Housing, environmental and civil rights laws, education funding, and funding for the arts. That's all super positive. There will be a lot of urban unrest during his presidency. King gets killed during his presidency, and there'll be tons of riots all over the country. And he has a hard time understanding why and trying to fix it. The counterculture rises to prominence during his presidency. Vietnam, huge black eye for America, a huge failure. He'll over-rely on FBI and Hoover, allowing them to do all sorts of gross things, and the CIA to spy on Americans, which is a huge failure for him. And he helped fuel the rise of the modern conservative party. He believed in experts. Conservatives rejected them as social engineers. He believed in expanding the power of a good federal government, and while conservatives wanted a small government and thought ours only messed things up, which is still basically how it works. So his legacy: no president has shown more compassion for the poor, the ill-educated, and minorities. His achievements were comparable to the New Deal. Poverty goes down, Medicare for the elderly, Head Start and education programs helped underprivileged kids, and infant mortality fell. No president since Lincoln had done as much for civil rights. The Great Society was hailed by liberals and hated by conservatives, although that's easy to note, but regular people like Medicare and Medicaid, right? Average Americans do. Political leaders maybe will argue about it. His programs were costly, though, required tax increases, and Vietnam is going to siphon off money and support for his New Deal, his Great Society, his expansion of the New Deal. So, in 68, he decides not to run. That's on the left. It was a shock. And on the right, that's him living out his days on his Texas ranch with his wife. He will die in the early 70s. All right, we'll talk more LBJ as we talk Nixon and Vietnam, but that's the end for it.